Good morning, dear students. In my previous sessions, we had discussed that interesting experiment of Pavlov's classical conditioning and Skinner box, which demonstrated operant conditioning. Today, we are going to focus on the key learning processes. When learning takes place, it can take place either because of classical conditioning, which is stimulus learning, or by means of operant conditioning. However, there are certain key learning processes which are common to both of them. Let's understand them today one by one. The first key learning process is that of reinforcement, followed by extinction, generalization, discrimination, and spontaneous recovery. Let us take up the first process, which is reinforcement. Now, what is reinforcement? We have already learned that in the previous session, that it is the operation of administering a reinforcer by the experimenter. Well, reinforcers, they are those stimuli which increase the rate or the probability of the responses that precede it. A positive reinforcer will always increase the rate of response, and that is what happens when you get a prize, right? Or when you get some kind of a reward. That is a positive reinforcer, and that will always increase the rate of response. Whereas negative reinforcers, they increase the rate of response that precedes their removal or termination. Ultimately, because of this negative reinforcement, like punishment or penalty, what happens is that you tend to unlearn that response. A primary reinforcer is very, very important biologically for your survival, like food for a hungry organism. On the other hand, the secondary reinforcer is the one which has acquired the characteristics of a reinforcer because of the organism's experience with the environment. For example, money, praise, acknowledgement. If you get good grades in the examination, your parents and your teachers, they acknowledge you in public. They basically reward you. And that is all a part of a secondary reinforcement. Now, let us take the next example, which is, or the next learning process, which is known as extinction. In this slide, you can see the examples of primary and secondary reinforcer. Now let us take up what is meant by extinction. Extinction means the disappearance of a learned response because of removal of reinforcement from the situation where the response occurs. If the occurrence of the CS, that is the bell, and the salivation, which is the conditioned response, is not followed by the US, which is the meat powder, in the case of Pavlov's experiment, or a lever pressing, in the case of Skinner box experiment, is not followed by the food pellets, the learned response is likely to get weakened and ultimately may disappear. So learning shows resistance to extinction. Interesting. It means that even though the learned response is now not reinforced, it will continue to occur for some time. However, with the increasing number of trials, the response strength gradually diminishes and ultimately it stops occurring. How long a learned response shows resistance to extinction depends on a number of factors. It has been found that with increasing number of reinforced trials, the resistance to extinction increases and learned response reaches at the highest level. There, the performance gets stabilized. After that, even if you make a large number of trials, they do not make a difference to the response strength. Resistance to extinction increases with increasing number of reinforcements during the time when you are acquiring that learned response. If the reinforcement is delayed, then resistance to extinction increases. If the reinforcement is continuous, which is given in every trial, the learned response becomes less resistance to extinction. But if you are giving partially, that is, sometimes you may give the reinforcement, may not give the reinforcement at the time when the learning is taking place, then there is more resistance to extinction. Now I come to the concept of generalization and discrimination, which is another key learning process. What is generalization? The tendency to respond to similar stimuli in a like manner is called generalization. Suppose an organism is conditioned to elicit conditioned response like saliva secretion on the presentation of a sound of the bell. After conditioning, of that particular response and another stimulus, if you present it like just like the bell you ring the telephone, all right, or it is a ringing of your mobile phone, the organism makes the conditioned response to it. This phenomenon of responding similarly to stimuli is called generalization. That means the sound of the bell was generalized to the sound of the telephone. Another process which is complementary to generalization is called discrimination, the learned ability to distinguish between two stimuli that are different. For example, you learn to distinguish between the intensity of the response that you need to make to a maths test and also to an English test. For example, if the child is conditioned to be afraid of a person with long mustache and wearing black clothes, but he meets a situation who is dressed in black clothes with a beard, the child may show signs of fear. This is generalization. But however, if he meets somebody else wearing white clothes or gray clothes and the person is clean shaven, he does not show fear. This is an example of discrimination. Discriminative response depends upon the discrimination capacity or the ability to distinguish on the part of the learning of an organism. So here is the difference between stimulus generalization and discrimination. Now we come to spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery occurs after a learned response is extinguished. Suppose an organism has learned to make a response for getting reinforcement. Then the response is extinguished. That means completely removed and some time has passed. Now, we can ask a question that whether this response will be completely extinguished and will not occur at all, even if the conditioned stimulus is presented. Well, interestingly, it has been demonstrated that even after the lapse of considerable time, the conditioned response or the learned response is able to recover itself and occurs to the conditioned stimulus. So the amount of spontaneous recovery depends upon the duration of the time lapsed after the extinction session. The longer the duration, the greater is the recovery. This phenomena is referred to as spontaneous recovery, as you can see from this particular graph. So I hope with this, you are able to understand what are the key learning processes, which are that of reinforcement, then extinction, generalization, discrimination, and finally spontaneous recovery. That means even after a considerable point of time when no reinforcement is given to the organism can still recover the previously learned response. In other words, learning is not completely forgotten. Thank you and have a good day.